Hello and welcome to our fourth video of the video lecture series. This is ecology, and ecology is the study of the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic parts of the environment. And so our abiotic portions would be the things that are non-living. So that would be like the air up here in the atmosphere. It would be something like the rain that falls on this grassy field. It might be the rocks and the soil beneath these plants. The biotic, those would be the living portions of the atmosphere or the biosphere. So the living portions, we'd have the flowers, we'd have the tree, a lot of different living portions here. This nice little acronym, BECPO, is a good way to think of the organization of life. And so our largest part of the organization here is the biosphere. And the biosphere is a combination of these other spheres, and it's kind of the living things on top of them or within them that rely on them. So the biosphere would be all the living things in the atmosphere, like the birds, the bees, anything that's floating around in the air that's alive, the pollen from the trees or the flowers. The lithosphere, that's the rocks and the soil beneath us, the upper crust that everything lives on top of, and then the hydrosphere, that'd be like the water on Earth, in the oceans, in the rain, that kind of thing. But the biosphere is kind of overlapping all of them. It's the kind of the living layer on the surface of the Earth. The next level of organization is the biome, and biomes are noted by similar plant and animal life, and usually they're really similar climates and geography in similar biomes. So this map here shows all the different biomes on Earth. And these biomes are kind of shown by the different colors here. Now, it's not the most specific map because there are kind of subcategories to each of the biomes. But if you look here at Florida where we're located, this light green color shows deciduous forest biome, and we see similar biome over here in Europe and a similar biome here in Asia. And if you look at this on a globe, this biome kind of happens at the similar latitudes, and really important that they have similar amounts of precipitation on them. A different type of biome, this orange part, shows the deserts on Earth, and this desert biome, again, is going to be categorized by having low annual rainfall, much lower than what we see in the deciduous forest. And they would have similar plant species growing and animal species living in the desert, and those would be very different, most likely, than what we see in the deciduous forests of Florida or Europe or Asia. The next level is the actual ecosystem itself. So the ecosystem itself combines all the living and non-living things living and interacting with one another. And so within the biome, you're going to have different ecosystems. And so you might have a lake ecosystem, you might have a mountain coniferous forest ecosystem, but it's going to be both the living and the non-living things that are within close proximity and interacting with one another. The next level, we drop it down from there, is the community. And so the community is going to be all the organisms. So this would just be living things. So we've got the moose. And how does the moose and the wolf interact with one another? Well, the wolf eats the moose. It would be, how does the moose interact with the pine trees? Or the pine trees get eaten by the moose. And then you've got all these, the owl, the groundhog, and the rabbit here. How do they interact with one another? So different species living in close proximity and how they interact. Below community, or within the community, you've got populations of animals, and we've got a population of elk. A population would be all the elk living within this community, or within this ecosystem, or within this biome. So we kind of define how big of a scale we want. We might be talking about the population of humans on Earth, or we might be talking about the population of elk within Yellowstone National Park. But for a population, they all must be the same species, and they have to be interacting with one another. Underneath that, you've got the individual. This would just be a single organism, so this would be the one single elk. We could talk about plants, right? It could be the one single tree, but it's just an individual organism. Ecosystem roles. So niche is a word that kind of defines or is defined by the roles or kind of the job that the organism plays within the environment. And so the role for different organisms is very different. And some organisms are very specialized for very certain roles, and others can cover a wide range of roles. And so the first type we're going to talk about is the specialist. And the koala is an excellent example of a specialist. We call them specialists because they kind of specialize in one thing. If you're familiar with koalas, you know that they only consume eucalyptus leaves as their sole source of food. They will not eat other types of food, and so they have a very narrow range, right, of resources that they can use. They have to be located somewhere where they have access to eucalyptus, or they'll starve. They won't have anything they can eat. So this specialist has this very narrow range of conditions in which they can live, and then they're going to avoid forests that don't have eucalyptus because they won't be able to survive there. On the other end, you could have something like a raccoon. We call raccoons generalists, meaning they really can adapt well to any environment you throw them into, right? And so we see that up here on the graph. They've got a very wide range of utilization up here, or resource use. So raccoons, they can be omnivores, they can eat plants, they can eat animals, they can catch lots of different foods like small lizards, insects, even fish and mussels and things like that grow in the water. So they are very well adapted to a wide range of things. And so they have a generalist niche, meaning they can fill a lot of different roles in a lot of different ecosystems. Something that's a specialist, like a koala, is very susceptible to change, right? If we have a disease that wipes out eucalyptus plants, the koala is not going to be able to survive. Where if you took a main food staple for the raccoon, let's say all the crayfish in a stream died, that raccoon has the general stability to rely on things like nuts or berries or leaves or small lizards or cockroaches or anything it can get its hands on. So the generalist is much more adaptable to changes in the environment. Specialist is very vulnerable, and so humans with habitat degradation can really kind of overwhelm these specialists or put a lot of pressure on them. Think about panda bears in China, right? They only eat bamboo, a very specialized species. As those bamboo forests diminish, as China's population explodes, it's becoming harder and harder for them to survive on their own. Organism interactions. This would be interaction between two organisms, and there are a couple different ones. The first one of them is symbiosis, also known as mutualism. In symbiosis, you have both parties receiving a positive benefit, right? The flower, in this case here, is going to get the positive benefit of pollination, right? It needs the bee in order to reproduce. So by having the bee visit it, it gets that reproduction. The bee also has a positive benefit, right? It's getting sugar, and there's a little lump of sugar here on its hind legs that it is collecting from the plant and taking back to the hive to share with its bee buddies. So symbiosis, both of those are positive interactions. Parasitism is the next type of interaction. In parasitism, you have an unequal balance here. So in this case, the mosquito gets the positive benefit, of course, right? It draws the blood, it gets the energy from its host. The host then receives the negative interaction. So we've got a positive for one, negative effects for the other one. That human is losing energy, right? The blood that's being taken from it required energy to produce and was serving a purpose. Without it, the human lost energy. Excuse me. The next part is commensalism. In commensalism, you get a positive benefit for one party. The barnacles, in this case, receive a positive benefit from the whale, right? The whale feeds on plankton, and it moves throughout the ocean. The barnacles also feed on plankton, but they cannot move. By attaching themselves to a whale, they ensure that there's always going to be a plentiful supply of plankton around. And then the other benefit is the whale also moves, and it's hard for barnacles' natural predators like sea stars to get to them. It's kind of like a moving target. It's tough for the starfish to get on top of a whale because the whale is not going to stop and let the starfish climb on. And then the other party, so the whale in this case, receives no benefit or no cost, right? It doesn't hurt the whale having barnacles on them. Whales can carry about 1,000 pounds of barnacles without suffering any real drag issues or buoyancy issues. It also doesn't hurt their skin. It's a harmless thing to have on top of them. So there's no benefit and no cost for the whale. The barnacles get the positive benefit. That is commensalism. One species benefits, the other one has no effect. The next type is predator-prey, right? In this case, we have a very obvious benefit and a very obvious cost. This interaction is simply hunting, and it happens in a lot of organisms, and there is kind of a unique predator-prey interaction we're going to look at. And that's the relationship between the population numbers. So this is an old study done in the 1930s between the lynx and the hare, and kind of how the population varied throughout the years. And so the researcher was simply set up in the forest and managed the numbers or counted the numbers of organisms that they saw and graphed it over this graph. And what you see is pretty interesting. The light colored line here, this would be the lynxes, and the dark colored line, this would be the number of hares. And so there's this kind of lag relationship where as you have a high number of lynxes, you have a very low number of hares. And the lynx requires the hare to get energy. So if there are a lot of lynx hunting a very small number of rabbits, that's not going to last very long. It's not a sustainable thing, right? They've kind of overshot the carrying capacity, to use last unit's vocab words, and you get a crash in the lynx population. When the number of lynx decreases rapidly, that leaves a lot of room for the hares to expand. There's no longer that hunting pressure, right? We went from what was about 50 lynx all the way down to what looks like about 10 lynx. So we lost about 80% of the lynx in this segment of time here. And so the hares have a lot less pressure, meaning they're much freer to reproduce. They're not really being hunted. And when you do that, you end up with a lot of hares or a lot of resources. And again, the lynx, now that there's fewer of them and there's a lot of hares, there's plenty of resources to go around, they're going to reproduce and expand. And so you get this peak of the prey species, followed by a peak of the predator, followed by a drop of the prey species, followed by a drop of the predator. And it happens really consistently in all ecosystems with all different types of predator and prey. And this is a very well-known relationship. The next part here is the niche overlap, and so what can happen here is resource partitioning. So we've got hawks and owls both feed on the same thing, right? Small rodents, snakes, maybe birds, those types of things. If they both were out hunting at the same time, you would have what's called a region of overlap, where their niche overlapped, where the hawks and the owls would be competing for the same set of rabbits or the same set of birds. And that competition is not good for either party in this case, right? Species 2, let's say that's the owl, is going to get less rabbits if species 1, the hawk, is also hunting for them. And so usually what happens over time is they develop adaptations that allow them to hunt at different times. And so what we get is we get the eagle or the hawks hunting during the day and the owls hunting at night. Each of those things requires different adaptations, right? The eagle or the hawk is going to have to hunt from a higher altitude and be able to dive further, while the owl is going to have to develop really fantastic night vision to be able to see those animals at night. And you end up with this gap in the middle where no longer are they competing, right? When the hawks are going to sleep, and finished hunting for the day, the owls are waking up and going right at it. And this is also seen in a pretty famous study of warbler species. And so these species of warbler are all very similar birds and they require the same resources. But what has happened is they've made adaptations and partitioned the resource in order to look for food in different areas of pine trees. And so you've got the Cape May warbler that's looking strictly on the outer top of the pine tree, and you've got the black-throated, which is focused more on the middle and a little bit on the inner branches. And each of them has kind of picked out a different area that they hunt or are specialized for hunting for their prey in, which would be small insects mostly. Another thing that can happen is if you've got competition and it's not equal competition. So the previous example of hawks and owls, they're pretty similar birds. There's not really a big difference between the two of them. But if you took away, let's say, the great eyesight of the owl and hawks had much superior eyesight compared to them, what you'd end up with is this graph over here. And what this graph is showing is that strong competitor, in this case the hawk with normal eyesight, is going to be able to take over, and it's not going to share, right? It's going to force the owl, if we took away the owl's eyesight, to occupy a smaller niche. And the reason why is because this species 1 is such a better competitor, right? It can get to these contested resources and take them away from species 2. So that the hawk here would be specializing in hunting its prey, so much so that the owl wouldn't be able to get some. And it would force the owl to go outside. Maybe the hawk avoids snakes because snakes could be poisonous and they could bite you. And so the owl would exclusively be feeding on snakes here. It's a much narrower resource, and it's beginning to look like a specialized, a specialist instead of a generalist. Species types. All right, two types of species types that are kind of tough to keep apart, and they are the foundation and the keystone species. Now, I know this picture is not the easiest to read. The foundation's here at the bottom of the pillar. The keystone is here at the top. And so the same is true for the species. If we removed the keystone species from the environment, all the other little bricks or all the other organisms within the environment would collapse, right? Because so the keystone is really important for supporting the environment. They perform some sort of vital role that supports this whole ecosystem around them. It may not be reflected in their numbers, right? You could have very few keystone species supporting a very large ecosystem, and that would be pretty normal. The foundational species are something that kind of changes the actual ecosystem itself and makes it the way that it is, right? Gives it the properties that define it. So they kind of hold everything up from the bottom by changing the actual ground itself, where the keystone species kind of support the organisms that are there. These are three pretty well-known keystone species. We've got the purple sea star. Purple sea star really likes to eat mussels, and because it focuses on mussels, it kind of keeps the marine invertebrate population diverse, or the mollusk population diverse. So instead of the tide pools over in California being taken over and outcompeted by mussels, the purple sea star kind of controls their populations and allows other things to grow in their stead. Kangaroo rat is another keystone species. Kangaroo rat kind of keeps deserts. The way that they do it is they kind of feed on the seeds of grasslands, and the kangaroo rat was actually taken out of a desert landscape out west in the Arizona area, and that desert landscape is now an arid grassland because the grasses have taken over. So by not eliminating the seeds of these quick-growing grasses, the shrubs were outcompeted and couldn't keep up, and so it changed the entire ecosystem by removing this one keystone species. Prairie dog are another one, right? They're really important for turning over the soil, getting air and nitrogen cycles going in the grasslands, and so they play a very keystone role. Without them, we wouldn't have the luscious grasslands. Foundation species, so these are the ones that kind of set the ecosystem or set the environment. We've got kelp. They provide the shelter, a lot of room for other organisms to live, but without them you kind of have open water that wouldn't support this diverse ecosystem. Same is true for coral. And then the beaver is a pretty obvious example of foundation species. They physically alter the landscape by removing low-lying shrubs and bushes and by creating ponds that were once streams. So they are founding the environment. An endemic species is kind of a local species. This is a Florida bog frog. It's one of Florida's endemic species or native species. These ones were there well before humans got there, and we kind of try to support and protect them because they were kind of here first. Exotic and invasive. So these are two different things. Exotic species simply means any species that was not native here. And so a lot of our food crops like citrus oranges or cows are exotic species. The cows originated from North Africa and were brought all over the world because they're an excellent domestic animal for milk or for meat. Same is true for food crops, right? Corn is native to the United States and Mexico, Central America, but it's grown all over the world now because it's an excellent food crop, and so it's an exotic species. Invasive species has a negative connotation with it. These are species that have somehow managed to escape their ecosystem. Usually it's through human means. Someone carried the lionfish from the Pacific, tropical Pacific waters over to the Atlantic in the Keys and off the coast of Florida especially. And this is an invasive species now. It's really wreaking a lot of havoc with the reefs around here because it eats a lot of things, and not a lot of things over here can handle eating it. Kudzu is another example of an invasive species. It was brought over from Japan, and it has taken over some areas of the southeast United States. You may not recognize it, but this is actually a house located here that's been completely covered by kudzu. Now it's an abandoned house. You don't have to worry about your house being covered in the middle of the night by crazy kudzu plants. And that's kind of the end of video 4. I hope you enjoyed it. Please have some notes or something ready. Be prepared to discuss in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching.